I'm Francisco Estrada. I'm from the National Autonomous University from Mexico. I'm the head of the climate change research program over there. I work on integrated assessment modeling, and we have a wonderful degrees project. We're trying to assess the risk and benefits, the economic risk and benefits of deployment of SRM in case something goes wrong, as we expect is going to go wrong with international climate policy. So, well, that's it. And we have a day full of activities. No? We're going to start with the morning plenary. Then we're going to follow this by the introduction of some new initiatives. Today, don't forget, is the last day of posters. If you don't go see the posters, then you're going to lose them forever. You're never going to get another opportunity. We have a lot of parallel sessions. We have lunch. That's kind of okay. And then parallel sessions. And we have the closing plenary. Town hall, what might the future look like? That's an interesting question. And, well, we are also going to talk about the survey results. Housekeeping. If you lost something, then you can go and check if somebody has it somewhere. And there are going to be some changes in the parallel rooms. No? So keep your eyes open. You don't want to end up in another room. And Perspectives and Cryosphere has now moved to Buffalo. I don't believe that's in the US, but yes. Other thing, Degrees is now hiring. Anyone interesting? They have two positions, scientific writer and publishing lead, programs officer as well. Both require eligibility to work in the UK. Well, if you want to learn something more about this, please find somebody of the Degrees team or go to their website. And now I would like to give the floor to Hugh Hunt.
Thanks. Thanks, Francisco. Thanks very much. I'd just like to make an announcement about the conference we're holding in Cambridge, Cambridge University Arctic Repair, going from the 26th to the 28th of June. Do scan the QR code. So it starts on it starts on the Wednesday evening, I guess on the 25th, and runs through to the Saturday lunchtime on the 28th. It's just after some ARIA kickoff meetings, so it's quite good timing. And it's the week before the Tipping Points conference in Exeter in the following week. Do come along. We're going to start off with a discussion between indigenous people, both from the Arctic and from the Pacific Islands. So we hope they'll have a good conversation. There's lots of good fun things to do in Cambridge, good place to be. You know how in sports stadiums, those things they project onto the stadium. Well, I was hoping that we could project that QR code onto the grass on King's College Chapel so that we could see it directly. Anyway, it'd be great to see you guys in Cambridge in June, later on this year. Thank you very much.
Now we go to the session, anticipating and preparing for larger future governance challenges. This is an international panel of experts and policymakers that will reflect on future governance needs and what early steps might help limit risk and build capacity for effective climate response to global governments. And as a moderator, we have the one and only Ted Parsons. Please, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you. Please join me, colleagues. Thank you, Francisco. Thank you, Degrees, for this wonderful event and for hosting this panel this morning. As Francisco said, I'm Ted Parson from UCLA and the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. There's a very widespread consensus that I perceive in debates on SRM that the most important and most difficult challenges pertain to governance rather than to scientific or technological issues. But in my judgment, these debates tend to stop at an early stage and lack specificity or concreteness. And so there appears to be a need to proceed to try to get more specific and more operational and ask well, what governance challenges? How might they manifest? What might be sensible steps that identifiable actors might take that would help to anticipate and mitigate and respond to them? Now, the coming governance challenges, in part, perhaps in substantial part, they pertain to deployment. Things that various actors might say or do of the form of activities to develop capability, proposals to do so, demands or calls for international activities, but they're more diverse than that. They could include declarations from important actors that say this is a bad thing and we reject it and we threaten these consequences if anybody pursues development. They could take the form of aggressive assertions of unilateral legal authority by some actors. We can do this, you know, and it would be legal and you can't stop us. They could even take the form of charges by some people that somebody else is doing it and it's harming them. I'm just trying to sketch out the space of possible disruptive things that might come along in an area of capability as high stakes as this. The challenges aren't all about deployment either. You can imagine analogous challenges to governance that would arise from continued expansion of research programs or development of pre-deployment capabilities. So for this last day opening plenary, following the very rich discussions we've had all week, our degrees colleagues have granted me the sort of dispensation to convene a group of colleagues to think about these questions in an anticipatory way. I've invited the panel to join me in thinking ahead about future governance needs, promising directions, key issues, questions that need clarification, or widespread assumptions that might be questionable or incorrect. I want to stipulate at the outset, these are matters on which nobody is an expert. And there are also matters that involve forward-looking speculation about political challenges and responses that are unlikely to be authoritatively answered by research activities. Research can, of course, inform aspects of them, but is unlikely ever to be sufficient. So I want to thank my colleagues on the panel for their courage, for their willingness to join me in an exercise of exploration and speculation. And I do aim for the session to be exploratory and interactive. So I will pose a few open-ended questions and invite my colleagues on the panel to respond, presenting one or two sharp ideas about specific challenges, promising directions of activity, or rejections of the question and ways to make the questions sharper and more focused and more useful. I'll facilitate a conversation among the panel. I will try not to go beyond 20 minutes for that, and then we'll open it up for a broader conversation. And now for the broader conversation, with full recognition that what I'm about to say is dangerous, I don't intend to require that that conversation consist exclusively of questions. You are all invited to offer also proposals, alternative answers to questions the panel's addressed. But in taking this perilous step, I must charge you that whether question, comment, or proposal, the interventions must be on point and brief. So please, no long wind-ups, no manifestos, no personal or institutional marketing pitches. Yes, it's a temptation I've often fallen into. With that, let me briefly introduce my colleagues on the panel. So Andrew Light, to my right, Andrew Wright to my light, yeah, sorry, is now a distinguished fellow at the University of Chicago, and I love this title so much I have to say it in totality. Distinguished University Professor of Public Policy, Philosophy, and Atmospheric Sciences. Wouldn't you love to have all three of those on your business card? That's
totally suspicious.
No, I totally trust your expertise in all three areas. At George Mason University. That's following a long and distinguished career in NGOs and governments, most recently where he led international energy cooperation in his capacity as Assistant Secretary of Energy in the United States. Jeroen Oomen, to my left, is Assistant Professor in the Urban Futures Studio, also an institutional name that I love, at Utrecht University, where he studies society's conceptions of the future and their social, cultural, and scientific underpinnings. Cynthia Scharf, directly opposite me, is Senior Fellow for Climate Intervention at the Center for Future Generations in Brussels, following a previous career that has included stints as a journalist and as a climate change advisor to the UN Secretary General, and most recently as Senior Strategy Director for the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. So, with that, let me throw out a few questions to the panel, not to individuals, but basically open-ended questions, and invite any of you to comment briefly on any one you want. First, in the current debate, there appears to be a surprisingly strong and stable consensus on several early governance needs. A need for more research, for international research consultation and collaboration, for commitments to transparency associated with research, perhaps via a research registry, for assessment, for building monitoring capacity. So my question to the panel, to invite their speculation, is there anything else? Is there anything that might be a feasible and helpful early step in governance that is less obvious than these things? Cynthia.
Sure, I can dive in. To take your word obvious, sometimes what's most obvious is what's most overlooked. So in my experience of speaking with governments, with NGOs, with UN actors, I think it's really important to listen and hear what their questions are before launching into our monologue about what we think they need to learn. And I've found that that kind of an approach, a listen and learn approach, helps relax tensions, it invites questions, it diminishes suspicions, and it leads to really rich, productive building of trust, which is essential for moving a conversation forward with any actor, government or non-state actor. So for example, in my previous work with C2G, we had lots of discussions with over 60 governments around the world, and oftentimes we'd hear the same questions. Who's doing what? Who's paying for it? How do we know if someone's cheating? But there were a number of other questions that often came up, and so I just started compiling a list. And so a very obvious way to start that conversation is by compiling the questions they have and forming an FAQ that you then feed back to them so that they feel like they're really heard. It's not we're pushing an agenda on them. So that's just a specific example, a very low-tech option with one specific actor. I completely agree with the other interventions you mentioned, the transparency register, the monitoring. But just to say, let's not be too clever by half and start with the basic building blocks of trust.
It's very interesting. And just to follow up briefly, from all those consultations, is it your impression that there's a strong convergence in the specific character of the questions across widely different governments
Yes.
in different world regions of different development status?
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
in effect, there'd be a great value in a trusted common repository of information on simple factual matters that are often at the top of minds of government and I'm guessing also intergovernmental organization people when they first encounter the issue.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One thing I'd add to your list, and that was a great way of putting it, Cynthia, and obviously the devil's in the detail of how you do a registry and what transparency regimes. For folks who are interested in those kinds of things, the last thing I did before I went back into a Democratic administration on January 2021 was one of the authors of the National Academy of Sciences report led by Chris Fields that was published in 21, reflecting sunlight, and we dealt with a lot of the sort of the technical details of how you implement those things, so that's, people could look there. But the one thing you didn't mention, which I think is really important, is patent rights. Patent rights. There's no way to, there's no formal mechanism that I know of to enforce any of this now, but I think just the recommendation we make in the report is that solar geoengineering researchers should pledge not to assert patent rights against other researchers for doing similar work. I think that's a pretty important thing to put up there to try to eliminate the profit motive that might be, sort of concern for some.
Pledge not to assert them against other researchers.
So until there's a more formal regime to cover this thing, or a code of conduct, or what have you, it could just be prominent researchers who are engaged in this just sort of say it, and they might even say it publicly in different ways.
but it's not a comprehensive rejection of patent or other intellectual property
No,
rights,
not at
but
all.
rather part of an agenda of enforcing transparency of research.
Right. And
by
sharing information,
Yes.
sharing data, just socializing that to begin
Yeah.
with. Yeah.
Good, thanks.
Yeah.
Feel free, but yeah, not
No,
obliged.
I've been listening, and I think it was really interesting to hear things that I mostly agree with. But on the issue of trust building and specifically legitimacy building, it really matters how we do that, right? Because I feel like in this community, so a lot of the trust building is also failed for many different reasons, right? But I'm here as one of the very few representatives of the more skeptical crowd. And it's because they don't trust this conference. They're not here, right? And I don't know if that says something about them or it says something about here, but there's a real need for introspection on both sides of that camp. And I think on the issue of trust building, I very often hear, I'm all for trust building, but to me it often sounds as if we want to build trust just to give this field legitimacy and not to actually cede some of the control over the development of this field. And that's a very different kind of trust building that we're talking about, right? So I think that outreach is really important, but what is it for? Is it building our own sort of, like, making sure that people trust us to do what we want to do anyway? Or is it because we're actually thinking that these people might have something useful to add? And then these are very different things. And someone once asked me, okay, what could convince you that you're wrong about solar geoengineering? It's if the powerful people in the field would actually give away their power to people who aren't scientists, maybe I would think I was wrong about a lot of things. So that's sort of what I would like to pick up on that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So it's a very deep distinction between a commitment to a set of outcomes versus a commitment to a set of procedural norms or principles. I'm actually getting echoes here to a conversation I had with a Chilean scholar a few months ago on democracy and climate change, where he made the really deep claim that if you care about climate change, you care about a set of policy outcomes, and if you care about democracy, you care about a set of procedural norms about how decisions are made. And there can be tensions between these two, because sometimes the process you want doesn't yield the outcome you have in mind. And so I hear you evoking exactly that tension. Give away authority, and other people might not actually support the same path of concrete decisions that you think is right.
Yeah, and I think that tension is there. And it's at least important to be honest on where you stand on that.
Yep.
And you can care more about climate change than about democracy, but then don't go around saying I want to build trust, because you're not. You're just trying to build your own constituency, and that's a different thing.
Or solve climate change.
Yeah, exactly.
which is a larger aim than building your own power or sustaining your own power and constituency. To move on. Recently, two distinguished. Cynthia, did you want to engage on this, please?
I do want to just kind of comment on that. If I understand correctly, you're talking about manipulation to some degree. Using the experience of trying to build trust as a way to manipulate someone toward a specific outcome.
Behind closed doors, I would probably call it manipulation, but that would be to be provocative. In a space like this, I wouldn't call it manipulation.
And we can't be provocative.
Okay.
No, but it's more that, like, there are infinitely many ways to do trust building and outreach, and in practice, a lot of it is aimed not at the actual process of co-producing decision making, but really finding legitimacy for things that we already want to do. Like, this is the quintessential sort of thing that always happens with public participation. You can see it in like, policymakers do this all the time. And I'm not even necessarily saying that might be a bad thing. I think the dishonesty around it, also to ourselves, that we're not realizing that that is what we're doing, that's where I get very uneasy.
I guess in my experience, the trust building is the very first part of a conversation. It's not at a decision-making stage. It's at an information-sharing stage. So personally, I don't come in with a perceived outcome that I'm looking for. It's really, let's get to know each other and get to know your concerns so that we can take a conversation forward. But I think you have a valid point later down in the stage of potentially more than information sharing, but decision making.
Recently, two prominent bodies, the Climate Overshoot Commission and the EU Commission Group of Chief Science Advisors, have both advanced a proposal for a near-term concrete step related to governance. And they've both suggested a moratorium on large-scale interventions. May I ask you to speculate or reason on how such a moratorium might contribute to the development of good governance norms, practices, or capabilities on SRM, and at the same time whether there are potential pitfalls or failure modes that might be triggered by proposing or enacting a moratorium?
I'm going to speak against it, so I'd rather someone speak for it first. So.
Would anybody like to speak in favor of a moratorium?
Well, clearly I would.
A moratorium instead of non-use? Do we have that on the record here?
It depends on how you define the words, Andrew.
We have a whole session later on non-use that will dig deeply into terminology and boundaries.
I still like the word non-use better than moratorium, but
suspension, pause, renunciation. I mean, language is so elastic.
So the reason why I would still favor it, so I will preface this by saying the world is changing rapidly. So a lot of the concerns on both sides of the debate that were there 4 or 5 years ago are now dated, and we need to fundamentally reevaluate the world that we're in. And I don't think, I've only been here for a day and a half, so I can't really speak to that, but I haven't seen enough of that reevaluation, but I don't see it on my side of the aisle on this kind of thing either. So with that caveat, I think the reason to have a moratorium or a non-use kind of thing is because there are all kinds of implicit political forces that will pull this into political debates without reasoned decision-making. And I think having an explicit, we're not going to go here unless we really, really need to, and the devil, again, is in the details, because what does it mean to say unless we really, really need to, might slow those processes down. And I'm, honestly, I keep saying everywhere now that when I'm in the SRM space, there might be a moment very soon that all of you, or all of us, look back kind of wistfully to that moment of taboo, right? That it was terrible to do the research, but at least you knew the research was being done in a way that was cared for by people. And that there's a wider set of forces that might run away with this very soon. And this is for me the point of a non-use or a moratorium. In our current political climate, does it still work that way? I don't know. So I don't know where I land on that right now.
Can I?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. I think there's a big difference between a moratorium and a non-use. But I think a moratorium can easily slip into non-use, and this is my big concern. Non-use is like, we're never going to do this. We're never going to do it. Why would we be doing research? It's not clear. People have got a lot of important things they need to do, especially people who are passionate about responding to climate change. And I think there are other ways to get to socialization of the idea that we don't intend to deploy. A party doesn't intend to deploy. So there are benefits to a moratorium, but here's the problem I have. Like, just imagine, for example, that you could, in principle, get one agreed to universally, which is a huge lift, especially if you're looking at the Framework Convention or something that works on a consensus basis, which I think is low threshold. Probably it's just going to be a voluntary thing. But let's even imagine a scenario where you get one. 3 problems. First of all, if a moratorium provides social license for research, which is the argument I hear most prevalently, then I think that The problem is I don't think it'll be perceived that way if it happens, and it could chill research, in fact. So even though moratorium literally doesn't mean that you would stop things, it says we're going to pause things for a while based on certain conditions. Could be time, could be certain conditions.
Or we're going to pause some things in the hope that that will enable other things. We're going to
right, that's the theory of the case.
Yes, exactly.
But I think you put moratorium on some activity, what you project is undesirable, something that shouldn't be done, something you shouldn't even think about being done in the future. And I think that would be potentially weaponized by those who think that this should never be done. There's a moratorium. And I think we've seen cases on that, which I'd be happy to talk about later, with supposed de facto moratoriums, which I think actually don't exist. But think about this. Imagine that you are an advocate for doing research on solar geo, and then you go down the road of saying, let's do a moratorium in order to provide social license to that. So you lobby your representatives in your governments. So I'd go to the Hill, to the US Senate, and I'd say, Senator, I really want you to pass this moratorium because it'll allow research. And they do it, and they vote for it, and it's ratified. Then you come back a couple weeks later and say, now I'd like you to fund a national research program. They go, hold on a second. You want me to fund a national research program for something we've just said we shouldn't be doing in the future? I can imagine the budget debate on that. Do you think that's a clear path towards actually taking scarce resources and putting it towards a national program? And I would not do this in the US today, by the way, at all. So don't worry. I'm thinking about a US, like the administrations that I've served, the Biden administration, the Obama administration, committed to climate action, Paris, and et cetera, et cetera. So if you imagine that scenario, legislators only have so much time. There's lots of competing issues that you want to put money on the table for, and they would, I think, invariably, it would chill research, not enable it. The second thing, just two more quick points. I think that if a moratorium is not a non-use agreement, it says conditions for lifting, and you can't get agreement on it's 5 years, it's 6 years, it's 10 years, reviewable, et cetera. It's some conditions, like when there is adequate international governance. How are you possibly going to get agreement on such a subjective term? And there are many examples of this, and I think none of them would work. And finally, if you're worried about bad actors sign up to things that they say they're not going to do all the time. We've got hundreds of years of experience in this among our species, and they go ahead and do it anyway. So you get this perverse situation where a moratorium does not stop bad actors, and in fact, it chills those responsible actors or keeps them from moving forward.
Great.
Yeah, just some reflections on this. We work primarily in the EU context, and in December of last year, the European Union published 3 reports on SRM, and they called for an EU-wide moratorium. And I think it was precisely for the reason of providing social license. I think it's inadvisable to use the word moratorium. I think there are other ways to get at that concept, and not just by playing around with words, that seems a bit facetious, but really looking at what is the underlying concern that drove the need or the desire to have a moratorium. And I think that starts with a discussion, a more bottom-up discussion between governments, informally, not in any formal UN process, but a discussion about what would make them feel more reassured that we are not going down the slippery slope. So exploring what that means in a very informal sense, and then perhaps building kind of a coalition of the willing who set a variety of norms that they agree to adhere to, and then perhaps bringing in, for example, NGO actors or others within their own countries that hold them accountable for that, so that there is a connection to a social desire to have a reassurance, to have safety to it. But I would keep it out of any kind of formal process for many of the reasons that Andrew just cited.
Okay, so if we agree to stipulate that the risks of a pursuit of a formal binding moratorium-like process are quite severe, and we prefer a path such as you've articulated, Cynthia, that has sort of bottom-up early norm-building activities, do those activities end up having important points that look moratorium-like? Do they also include statements that we won't do certain things for now?
Sure.
But they're softer, they're more diffuse, they're less formal? Or are there more important ways that those might differ from the elements of a moratorium?
I am also thinking in the realm of the practical.
Yep.
So how do we increase transparency of research, give the public more confidence that this isn't some ruse by the fossil fuel industry to perpetuate their profits, et cetera, et cetera. Monitoring, the question very often came up when we had discussions with governments, how do we know if someone's cheating?
Yep.
So increasing those very practical steps provide reassurance, along with the questions of how do we couch this, what kind of words do we use, who do we bring along in the conversation?
Yeah. And Cynthia, you've given a fabulous connection to the next topic area I wanted to pose, because it is that I think for many people, the first and the most prominent concern they have when they hear about SRM and even about research is that activities in this space might, by some mechanism or another, weaken, resolve, or resources or attention or commitments to other elements of climate response that are absolutely essential and whose essentialness is in no way reduced by pursuit of SRM. So these are the concerns that go under the titles sometimes moral hazard, sometimes mitigation displacement. So there's different models that people have in mind when they worry about that. Some of them I think are just kind of individual level psychology. It's like we'd all rather put off difficult things to the future. It's like we sign up for health clubs and then don't go work out every day, and we resolve to save for retirement and then we don't do it. We resolve to cut emissions and then any excuse. But also there's the sharper, more political mechanism you identify, which is there are powerful parties in the world who have interests in the continued exploitation of fossil fuels and who can be expected to deploy any rhetorical tools available to argue for that. And something that looks like it might be a substitute, even though it isn't, or is to the most limited way, gives them an out. Or a tool to argue for what they want to do anyway. So can any of you suggest concrete near-term steps that any actor might take, it could be governments, IGOs, NGOs, or others, that might effectively mitigate the risk that consideration of SRM leads to an unacceptable further weakening of resolve to cut emissions? Or ideally, in a sort of naively happy world, can you think of ways that debates around SRM might somehow be configured to help strengthen the clearly inadequate support of other elements of climate response?
So a couple things here.
Yeah.
And I'm going to, I think there's a lot, obviously, that people have already said about the ways in which research and development on SRM can advance an adaptation agenda, can obviously extend time for adaptation. And then I also think there's even more interesting things that can be said about how modeling can reveal some of the most vulnerable parts of the world when you sort of start testing different scenarios. Put those aside for now, but happy to talk about them. I want to go back to your first question of what can you do concretely to deal with the moral hazard problem? And I've thought a lot about this because it's a sticky one. It's a serious one. I absolutely take it seriously. There are a lot of bad actors in the world, and they're always looking for top cover to continue doing stuff that they would like to do, business as usual. But this is an entirely speculative proposition. We have to realize that. There's no real concrete evidence for this. So I want to test it. I want to do some things out there in the world to see if we can trace whether or not people start changing investment portfolios, attitudes towards the seriousness of climate change. The only way to do that is to get away from this idea of what we have now is a hypothetical proposition of a hypothetical intervention, which is considered by some the future death of the world, whether you like it or not, or the savior of all humanity and against all those who naively think that mitigation can get us to what we want. So what do? We actually need more experiments. And how do you get a license for more experiments? You have more national research programs like the ARIA program that was launched yesterday, right? So I think that if you have public and transparent national research programs, then things like ScopeX would have happened actually quite quickly, right? So it was painful to watch the documentary and sort of see what Frank and David sort of gone through, and everyone did that. But what's the result of this? ScopeX is like a trophy on the wall for those who don't want to see SRM, and there are going to be other trophies on the wall for people in many in this room would like to see more research done. If we'd had a national program in the United States that said, okay, we're going to do a program, and like ARIA, we're going to say there's going to be some field testing. Then experiments like Scopex, if you agree with me, the formal term is de minimis in terms of environmental impact, zero or barely any in terms of what they're proposing to do. I can tell you from my experience now, which I didn't know 4 years ago, having been at the Department of Energy, 17 national laboratories, huge reservations, right, of former waste sites that are walled off from the public, things like that. You can do experiments like that. Had Frank and David been not raising private funds, but actually under the auspices of a national program with a transparency regime, with a public accountability regime, once they were done, we could have sent that balloon up over Hanford or over Rocky Flats or something like that in cooperation with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden, Colorado in less than 1 year. And I know this from counterpart examples that I have from other things that I did when I was in office the last 4 years. And let's say you magnify that by 10 experiments that haven't done that, right? Or 20 or whatever, that are improving the modeling in the meantime and doing good things. Then you can also do some other measurements. You do see big shifts in investment portfolios. The people who are investing in the trillions of dollars of renewable energy, they start shrugging their shoulders and going, okay, they've got another solution, so I'm not going to put all of my money in oil and gas. Do you see a big public movement away from concern about climate change? I think probably not, but I'm willing to test the proposition, and the only way you do that is you actually create a pathway to do more of these zero, completely low impact experiments and see what will happen.
Okay. So extracting the core claim here, I think I hear the very interesting argument that expanded research responsibly conducted may in fact tend to exactly this effect, which is not moral hazard.
We have some evidence. We have no evidence whatsoever right now.
Right.
So
let's give worth examining.
Now, is it sufficient evidence? Absolutely not. But it would be like doing a controlled medical trial. Let's say that suddenly, like American public opinion dropped considerably, which we tracked very, very carefully over longitudinal studies. My colleague Ed Maybach at George Mason University, Anthony Leiserowitz at Yale have been doing these longitudinal studies. They can trace this and sort of say, like, okay, does suddenly American public opinion fall because we're sending these tests and we know there's a national program and people are no longer concerned about climate change. They think it's well in hand and they stop buying electric vehicles or what have you. Again, you got to take the Trump out of the equation here. But if in terms of a test here, at least you'd have something, and if there was a huge shift, then we'd stop the program.
Great. Other thoughts from you or Cynthia on near-term steps that might mitigate or even reverse the moral hazard or mitigation displacement concern? Okay.
Yeah, I have many thoughts on this. I keep saying here
Give us the most important.
Well, I keep saying here that a lot of the times what I'm trying to do is not necessarily to disagree and say yes, but also you need to think about this. But with this, I actually fundamentally disagree. It's true that we cannot have positive evidence of mitigation deterrence. We can't positively prove that CDR was a mitigation deterrent. But if you ask me, the way it functions in climate politics is basically as a lie. Right? It is basically the promise that something can be delivered in the future, which by and large, difficult. Right? And I'm being generous about it. It also, and this is where it becomes really important, you can't do a controlled trial on culture, right? You just cannot do it because these things like SRM require so many different meanings in different spaces. Just the example of the way that carbon offsets are now, and I don't know if that is the same for you, but whenever I need to buy a plane ticket, I can offset my guilt by buying carbon offsets, right? There is a lot of research that shows that this makes it easier for people to buy tickets. And so you're getting all of these dynamics that you can never take back. And so that doesn't mean necessarily that it would shift the needle tremendously in investment portfolios, but it would change the terms of the debate. And I think we need to be fundamentally honest about the fact that yes, mitigation, deterrence, in some way, shape, or form will happen. Right? Does that mean that, this is a question where I'm sure a lot of you will disagree with me, like, for me that means an extreme caution with what we do in terms of research, but a lot of people here might say, well, some mitigation deterrence, I'll take it, because we still need to do this. But I think that the dishonesty about the fact that mitigation deterrence will happen, that it will be wielded, both in deliberate ways, because you talked about deliberate actors, but the configuration of the concerns that we're talking about in climate politics or environmental politics at large, it is all configured on a global scale around certain ideological constraints. And so it will be used within those ideological constraints. It is not a coincidence that a lot of our modeling for a very long time didn't allow in lifestyle changes, because it was basically thrown off the table at the very start of environmental politics as an institutional concern by the US, right? And so you couldn't do it because the US would not be on board. And the EU self-servingly, of course, also wanted that, but didn't want to be the bad guy. But so all of that will be in play. And SRM is a very good, so not in practice, but as a trophy on the wall of people fighting for a certain thing, SRM will be mitigation deterrence.
But you use the analogy of carbon offsets and CDR to make the case for the sort of evidence in favor of mitigation deterrence. Are SRM and CDR so similar in their psychological, technological, political dynamics that even if it were very strongly established that CDR had deterred or deflected mitigation, that you would expect the same thing to happen from SRM?
Yes.
Okay.
But maybe not to the people in this room, but yes, in the way that it would be. The first thing I try to tell my students, when you go into culture, the truth of the technology doesn't matter, right? It matters what people think about it, and what people think about it is made through manipulation and propaganda, if I'm being provocative.
So let me pull between the two of you here and say, okay, let me stipulate that this is all persuasive, but the question I'm trying to pose is there any concrete thing that anybody can do that might mitigate that perverse effect? So you're arguing for the existence of the perverse effect, and therefore what?
Well, therefore, so that was the original reason why why I thought we needed a non-use agreement. Has the world changed? Yes. So do I have an answer to your question? No, I was very happy to disagree with Andrew, because then I could avoid this question.
Thank you for modeling so clearly the honesty that you call for. Yeah. Cynthia, would you like to come in on this?
Yeah, I'm just going to come in on a very prosaic level of practical measures. I know it sounds nearly not as provocative as other things. But there are a lot of misconceptions when I've had discussions with decision makers and policy people about how much money this potentially might divert from renewable energy, or it's already diverting energy from money from clean energy transition. And when you provide the numbers, which I think are about 0.1% of all funding for climate, it goes into currently SRM. SRM 360 probably knows, they just launched their funding tracker. But there is this perception, and I agree with you in this fact that perception, that culture drives politics, and perception can very often be much more important than fact. So we have to accept that this is a reality, even if we don't think it's a valid concern.
Great. Thank you, panel. And at this point, I think I'm going to open it up to broader conversation and comment with the exhortation I gave at the start. It doesn't have to be a question, but it does have to be brief, on point, and disciplined. And this format is a little challenging for that. I'm going to stand up and turn. Wow. Okay. I'm going to go clockwise, and I'm going to start here. Matthias.
Yeah, good morning. 2 points. One on the observation that the word power is part of empower. So I think what we are here for, in part, is actually to empower a broader range of actors to become involved, and I think that's a good thing. And the result is more power, more broadly distributed. So just on that. The second one is on perhaps answering, because Jeroen doesn't tend to give practical answers, as he rightfully admits. Perhaps instead of him, I might say perhaps what he could also agree with, which is on the moral hazard point, the importance of not exaggerating the simplicity of political decision-making on SRM already at the stage of developing outlooks onto the future, scenarios, already there, including the messiness of the world and showing that what looks very simple and clean in a climate model might not look the same in the world of politics.
Thank you. And I just realized, because I've opened to not questions but comments, the panel doesn't have to respond to every comment. If it seems to clearly imply a request, I'll push it that way, but otherwise, okay, I'm going to, gentleman in the yellow shirt, second last row.
Yes, thank you for the great panel. I have a question about the moratorium and trust building. And I think it is very valid. I am for the moratorium. And if you cannot give up to say, okay, we will accept moratorium, how could you convince the skeptics on SRM to let you continue the research? I think it is important to have a trust between the supporters and critics. But I think you should give up something. And I think the moratorium is something you can give up to, okay, we will accept the moratorium, then let us to continue to research. I think that's the way to...
Thank you. I'm going to treat that one as a question primarily directed at Andrew. Yeah.
Yeah, since
and then go to...
anti-moratorium guy, and I'll try to be brief.
Everybody be brief, please. Yeah.
I won't repeat the three arguments I gave about why I think a moratorium is a bad idea, so you've got that out there to look at. But I just think, if you make a claim, well, I'd be in favor of a moratorium or a non-use agreement, you're looking at these as essentially the same thing, when they're absolutely not. Moratorium is supposed to be something that would be lifted under certain conditions, whether time or whether or not that something has happened, like governance has happened in some interesting way in an international sense, which I think would be very difficult to consider. So that means that you really think that a moratorium could effectively mean that it is, in fact, equivalent to a non-use agreement. And that bothers me greatly, because if you are in favor of non-use agreement, there's no point in doing research. And I can't emphasize that enough. Look at the terrible thing that sort of happened with this with the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is constantly referred to. I even heard it said many times this week that the CBD created a de facto moratorium. It absolutely did not, right? In 2010. It absolutely did not. In 2010, the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, in a non-binding decision, and I'll just repeat this again, invited the parties to consider 15 things under that umbrella, including not engaging in climate-related geoengineering outdoors. Now, that is not a moratorium, it's not a de facto moratorium, but it's even said by people in this community that there's a de facto moratorium, right? So this is where you use you use something that even approaches the M word, you don't pay attention to the details, and suddenly it takes off like wildfire and has a life of its own. So if you think if you take that example seriously, then a formal moratorium absolutely would be used now and forever, I believe, as something to be used to stop any possible deployment and chill research.
But the question went in a slightly different direction. So let's stipulate I agree with the criticism and concerns about moratoria in general and the way the CBD was enacted. The question is, if you reject a moratorium, how do you build the trust necessary to provide social license to
Cynthia has the
research?
answer. Cynthia's got a really good answer here. No, the answer she gave already, right? The answer she gave already.
Good point. Cynthia did, yeah.
You start with what Pascal's trying to do, like a club of countries. Others sort of have talked about this. You start building norms, and part of those norms include not only transparency and responsible research and all the other good things that Ted started with, but they also include commitments that we are just not going to be deploying.
Great. Thank you.
And without signing something as formal as a moratorium.
Okay. So there's so many hands, and I know I'm not going to get around, so I'm going to, after Luke, I'm going to start skipping over so that there's equity among the quadrants, which is very challenging procedurally. Yeah.
Isn't a bunch of relatively, compared to the global average, rich white people calling for a moratorium on SRM, in fact, speaking for the people most impacted by climate change and removing a tool that, look, I'm the dumb balloon guy, maybe I'm missing something, but this theory that anyone on this continent gets to live the quality of life that we have via mitigation, like, please point me to that and please explain it to me how we're not removing the most powerful tool for people to actually achieve development.
Okay. Is a moratorium an imposition upon the vast majority of people in the world that is not
I'm not that cynical, so
yeah.
I don't agree with that view. You know, I understand what you're saying. I'll take it as an interesting statement.
Yeah. But you're also rejecting a moratorium.
Yeah, but I don't think that the people
who
who propose a moratorium are actually trying to keep everyone else down. I don't think that's true at all.
And also, I think it's a fundamentally unfair mischaracterization of how politics works that I run into all the time since we've done that non-use agreement. Because the way of the world is that a lot of things are imposed on a lot of people all the time, right? We cannot pretend like there is an equal power distribution. And the other thing is, Peter Irvine always makes the great point that for a lot of people, climate change is also an ideological construct that allows us to fight for other things that we might want. So what I sort of, the implication that I kind of find problematic in your statement is that everyone should aspire to live the lifestyles that we get to live. I think we all should, a lot of us in this room shouldn't have the lifestyle that we have, right? And yes, that is my ideologically inflected sort of position on this.
Okay.
But so is yours.
Yep. Okay. Gentleman, yeah. Dark shirt. You, sir. Yeah. And I apologize. I'm going to have to skip over many hands. Yeah.
Thank you so much. My comment was there regarding the 0.1% funding diversion from renewable energy. So what I feel, I am a researcher working on renewable energy. What I feel intrinsically is that the funding diversion might not be a big issue, but the diversion of attention, focus, and urgency of implementing renewable energy might be a bigger challenge and concern.
Great, thank you. There are many resources necessary to make progress, and money is one of, yep. Yeah, Todd? Yeah, Todd, yeah.
So I largely agree with most of the stuff that Andrew said, and I think it is the way to go to have groups of countries to try to develop the national systems that can allow this. The thing that I don't agree with is that there's a need for research or polling or anything else to figure out where the fossil fuel industry would like to go with this. I mean, we've seen this for 30 years. I mean, there's a very, very clear record, and there's nothing about, I mean, that's why they support CCS, that's why they support anything that can extend their license. So I don't think we need to go into the effort to try to prove this in some
and you don't think the fact they haven't yet spoken on SRM is significant in this regard?
No,
yeah.
I don't, because I think that they probably don't think that they need to be doing that yet.
Yeah.
So just
at such point as they think that they